All right, let's dive into this deep dive, shall we? A request that came straight from you guys, the listeners. This one is on a guy named Henry Clay, a major player in early American politics, but never actually made it to the White House. And that's what's so interesting. A lot of you wanted to understand, why? Why did someone so influential never grab that brass ring?
Yeah, this is a really good question. It's a bit of a head scratcher, isn't it? Because he was right there in the thick of things. I mean, he served in Congress, helped hammer out treaties, even landed the Speaker of the House gig, all by the time he was, what, 34?
Yeah.
But yeah, that top spot, it always slipped away.
Okay, so we're going to be looking at an episode of the American History Hit podcast, the one with Eric Brooks. He's a historian over at Clay's Estate in Kentucky. So, to set the stage, can you give us a sense of what the political scene was like back then? Because, no Twitter, no 24/7 news cycle. It had to be a whole different ballgame.
Oh, totally. Picture this. No primaries as we know them today. No televised debates. No social media feeding frenzies. I mean, can you imagine? And get this, campaigning itself, going out there and stumping for votes, it was considered like unseemly, bad form. Your reputation, your climb up the ladder, that all came from years of service, wheeling and dealing behind the scenes.
So, in that environment, how did someone like Clay, how did he even get noticed?
Clay, he was born way back in 1777, and the guy had charisma in spades. I mean, serious persuasive ability. There was actually this anecdote about a congressman who straight up refused to meet Clay. Said he was too afraid of being totally won over by the guy's charm. And that charm, that was Clay's secret weapon, building relationships, forging those crucial alliances. That was how things worked back then.
Okay, so I can see how those skills, they get you pretty far. But was it enough, to win the presidency?
Well, that's where the plot thickens, right? Because Clay, he was a master legislator, a real deal maker. He was all about finding compromises, trying to keep those different factions happy. Take, for example, his American system. Now, this was his big idea. Tariffs to protect American industries, infrastructure projects, canals, roads, that sort of thing. And to top it off, a national bank to, keep the economy humming along.
Sounds pretty forward thinking for the time.
It was. But this vision, it put him on a collision course with, well, another rising star, a guy named Andrew Jackson. Now, Jackson, war hero, tons of populist appeal. He saw Clay's system as benefiting the elite, at the expense of the everyday guy. And this rivalry, oh boy, it became a defining factor in all those runs for the presidency.
Right, and then you've got this massive issue, can't ignore it, slavery. You said Clay was right there in the middle of everything, so.
Yeah, and this is where things get a little messy, because here's the deal. Clay, he was a slaveholder himself. But at the same time, he could see just how divisive this whole issue was.
Yeah.
So what'd he do? He pushed for gradual emancipation. But with a twist. He wanted to send freed slaves to Liberia.
So trying to find that middle ground again, just like with the American system, but was it genuine? Was he really trying to solve the problem, or was it, more about political chess moves?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And we got to remember, we're talking about a time when image, public perception, it was everything. Now, the American Colonization Society, the folks pushing that whole Liberia idea, well, they're mostly white folks, and they saw it as a way to, to manage what they saw as a threat to the status quo, I guess you could say.
So even if Clay was sincere about compromise, he was still working within a system that was, built on inequality.
Exactly. It really exposes the complexities, the moral gray areas of the time. Even for someone like Clay, who on the surface seems like he's trying to do the right thing. And this whole slavery thing, it's going to come back to, to haunt him later on.
Okay, so let's get to Clay's first real stab at the presidency, the 1824 election. Sounds like it was a real barn burner.
Oh, it was a free-for-all.
Yeah.
You had four major contenders vying for the top spot. John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, and of course our man Clay. But here's the kicker. None of them, not a single one, got a majority of the electoral votes. So guess what? Off it goes to the House of Representatives.
And that's where Clay, as Speaker, he really gets to flex his muscles, right?
Oh, he was the power broker, even though in the Electoral College, he came in fourth. But get this, he couldn't stand Jackson, thought the guy might turn into a dictator. So he throws his support behind Adams.
But that move, that's where we get the whole corrupt bargain story, right?
Bingo. Adams, once he's in office, he makes Clay his Secretary of State, and everyone's crying foul, saying it was payback for Clay's support. Whether it's true or not, the perception of a shady deal, it really tarnished Clay's reputation. Remember, this was a time when campaigning was considered like beneath you. Any whiff of a power grab, and oh boy, you were labeled corrupt.
It feels like this early loss, it really cast a shadow over, the rest of his attempts at the presidency.
No doubt. It proved just how much public image mattered, how even a political whiz like Clay could get tripped up by accusations. And this 1824 election, it was a turning point for American politics. New parties popped up, alliances shifted, and guess who was right in the middle of it all?
I think I can guess, but I'm all ears. Tell me what happened next.
So after all that drama in 24, you have this new party emerge, the Whigs, and Clay, he was like their poster boy. Basically, they were the anti-Jackson crew. They thought the guy was dangerous or a real threat to, how the country should be run.
So Clay and Jackson, they were still, locked in this political cage match.
Oh yeah, big time. And it all came to a head again in the 1832 election. The Whigs, they represented this more modern, America, focused on the economy, unity. They were all about Clay's American system tariffs, infrastructure, that national bank he kept pushing for.
But Jackson, wasn't he the incumbent by then? And didn't he have, crazy high approval ratings?
He did, yeah. Jackson, he really knew how to tap into that populist wave, especially in the South and the West. To a lot of folks, he was a hero, the champion of the little guy. And for Clay, well, that made things kind of tricky. He started looking like, the establishment guy, the one Jackson was always raging against.
So Clay's whole thing, the compromising, the deal-making, maybe that actually hurt him in this election.
It's funny how that works, right? In Congress, that skill, it was pure gold. Getting things done, finding common ground. But running against a guy like Jackson, all fire and brimstone, well, it made Clay seem kind of weak, wishy-washy. People wanted a leader who'd, fight for him.
And Jackson, he had that fighter image down pat.
Oh, yeah. Campaigns on his military record, strong personality, man of the people. Clay, he came across as, well, more of a politician, the kind of guy who'd maybe, bend the rules a bit, compromise on his principles to get what he wanted.
So another loss for Clay. Did he ever get another shot at the presidency?
He did. 1844, he went up against James K. Polk, a Democrat, not super well known. Actually, he'd been hoping for the VP slot initially.
This was Clay's third try, right? So what were the big issues, the hot topics in that election?
The elephant in the room was Texas, annexation, whether to bring it into the Union or not. And boy, was that a powder keg. Tied up with the whole slavery debate, could have led to war with Mexico. It was messy.
And how did he play this one?
At first, he was against it. Annexation, I mean. Worried about upsetting the balance between slave and free states. Didn't want to risk war. But then, well, he kind of changed his tune. Tried to appeal to, to everyone. And that backfired big time.
So again, the compromising, which had always been his strength, it trips him up on the campaign trail.
It's almost poetic, isn't it? Polk, he saw the opening and went right for it. Painted Clay as a flip-flopper, someone you couldn't trust. And it worked. People, they want a leader who knows what they stand for, someone who's consistent.
Yeah, the American History Hit podcast, they made a big deal about how Clay's waffling on Texas, that's probably what sunk him. It's like a textbook example of how political games, they can really come back to bite you.
Totally. And there was another wrench thrown in the works, too. A third-party candidate, abolitionist, pulled away some of those votes that, that might have gone to Clay.
So sometimes it's just bad timing, the unpredictable nature of politics that gets you.
It's always a factor, isn't it? But even with those headwinds, Clay's inability to really take a stand on Texas, that sealed the deal. He lost, and not by much, but that was it for him. The end of the presidential road.
3 times he tried, 3 times he fell short. Kind of rough for someone who had so much influence, But even without winning the White House, he definitely left his mark. You can't deny that.
Well, absolutely. In a lot of ways, those losses, they're part of his story. His strength, it was really in Congress, where he could work those deals, bring people together, steer the ship during those stormy times. Maybe, and this is just a thought, but maybe the presidency, it would have been too confining for a guy like Clay. Force him to, pick sides, lose that ability to find that middle ground.
Interesting point. Maybe the great compromiser, that's who he was meant to be. But what about his legacy, the long-term impact? He's often mentioned as like a mentor figure for Abraham Lincoln, right?
Yeah, and that connection, it's pretty fascinating. Lincoln, young lawyer from Illinois, he idolized Clay, loved his speeches, his dedication to keeping the country united, even adopted a lot of Clay's policies later on. And their backgrounds, I mean, talk about different worlds.
So Clay's impact, it goes beyond specific laws or, political maneuvering. It's about his whole approach to politics, the belief in compromise, the commitment to public service.
Exactly. He shows us that leadership, ambition, it's complicated. It's about knowing your strengths, finding your place to make a difference. For Clay, it was compromise, building consensus, not the Oval Office.
It's kind of crazy, thinking about it. Today, compromise, it's almost like a dirty word in politics, seen as weak.
Yeah, it's sad, isn't it? Because compromise, at its heart, it's about progress. It's about saying, okay, maybe we don't get everything we want, but we can move forward together. It's not about abandoning your principles.
Reminds me of that saying, politics is the art of the possible. Got to be willing to give a little, to get a little.
Exactly. Clay understood that. He was willing to work with anyone, even people he disagreed with. And, he got a lot of flack for that, even from his own side.
Yeah, there's a lesson there for today's politicians, especially now when things feel so, divided.
Clay, he was a pragmatist. He cared about results,
Mhm.
not just, sticking to some ideology no matter what. He focused on building those bridges, finding that common ground.
It's about really listening, even to people you disagree with. And you can usually find some shared interests, things you can work on together.
Right. And that takes humility, admitting that maybe, you don't have all the answers,
Yeah.
and that working together, you can actually come up with something better than going it alone.
Clay, he was good at that, finding the best possible solution, even if it wasn't perfect, especially on those tough issues. Slavery, westward expansion.
He kept the country from tearing itself apart. Maybe not everyone was thrilled with the compromises, but they prevented disaster, and that's something to be said for that.
So as we wrap this up, this deep dive into Henry Clay, the great compromiser, he never made it to the White House. What can we take away from his story?
I think it shows us that ambition, even when you're talented, it doesn't always equal success. It's about playing to your strengths, finding the best way to make a difference.
Yeah.
For Clay, that was through compromise, consensus building, not the presidency.
Maybe, just maybe, his impact was even bigger because he didn't win. The great compromiser. That let him bridge those gaps, shape policy for years.
There's more than one way to be a leader. You don't need the highest office to really change things. It's a good reminder.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Henry Clay, fascinating guy, never president, but his story, it still speaks to us today. It's about American politics, about compromise, about trying to build a better country, even when it's hard.